Be agreed to.
Speaker.
Bill Twyford.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I speak in support of this bill, the Local Government Borrowing Bill, at first reading. Labor thinks this is an excellent bill, a sound, sensible idea that we're happy to support, and we look forward to debating it at Select Committee. It makes eminent sense for the local government sector to come together and form a bond bank with the support of central government. It's estimated, sir, that this will save the New Zealand ratepayer something in the order of $25 million a year. That's not to be sneezed at. And this is a very practical response to the problem that many councils face around the country, and that is the challenge, particularly over the next 6 to 7 years, of funding the infrastructure bulge, if you like, the catch-up that many councils are having to make to build infrastructure all around New Zealand. So we support this bill. We support the idea that because it makes total sense for the savings of Kiwi investors to be mobilised to invest in local government infrastructure. And so we believe that is a much better option than the privatisation, the PPPs, public-private partnerships, that this government has been so keen to advance over the last couple of years. We prefer the option that community-owned infrastructure around New Zealand stays in public hands and community ownership. And this legislation, this bill, sir, to establish a bond bank or a local government funding agency is one way that that aim can be advanced. The concept of the local government bond bank was first proposed by the Capital Markets Development Task Force, which was set up by Labor in 2008 and reported back to the government in 2009. And while the government has said that it supports this recommendation, it's odd, I think, that it has dragged its feet to the extent that we're only now seeing this bill come to the House. The idea of a bond bank for local government was raised at the so-called Jobs Summit, and it's taken a full 2 years or more, sir, for this bill to see the light of day. The funding agency is a win-win for local government, for New Zealand investors, the so-called mum and dad investors, but it's also going to make a contribution to the deepening of New Zealand capital markets, which is something I think we all agree is a great benefit. We're particularly keen, sir, to support this bill because it provides an alternative to the agenda of privatisation and PPPs that this Minister of Local Government has been so keen to advance. And I ask the House, sir, to cast minds back 18 months when it wasn't this quiet, unassuming, lame duck local government minister that we see in the House tonight, but it was the Minister of Ratepayers, the self-styled Minister of Ratepayers. He was more of a rooster than a lame duck. His feathers were shiny, his best years were ahead of him, and he was there, sir, there to single-handedly reform the local government sector. He was going to rescue the ratepayer from spiralling costs, skyrocketing rates, and councils that were just out of control. And so his agenda was called last year, was called the Transparency, Accountability and Financial Management Agenda. And he wanted to bring in mandatory referenda for councils if they wanted to step outside the terms of their long-term plans. He wanted to restrict them to an arbitrary definition of core services. He wanted to privatise the water sector, and he was going to clean out red tape and liberate the New Zealand ratepayer from the oppression of free-spending, profligate local authorities. Well, how far the mighty have fallen. And this modest, sensible and pragmatic bill, sir, that we are very happy to be supporting tonight is a far, far cry from the zealotry and extremism of Rodney Hyde's local government reform agenda. Now, when Rodney Hyde set out on this track, sir, only 18 short months ago, he began to lay the groundwork to try to justify his cuts for local government, his agenda to roll back the scope of local government and to open the door for privatisation. And he tried, sir, in a number of speeches and public statements to paint a picture that councils were out of control, that they were doing all these terrible things that they should never be doing, that they were spending ratepayers' money with abandon, and that they simply would not have the financial resources to invest in the infrastructure that's needed. But a couple of things happened, sir. We saw that Cabinet pulled the rug out from under his feet and told him that he wasn't going to go anywhere near that reform agenda that he was proposing after all the damage he caused in Auckland. But as importantly, what we saw coming out of the Office of the Auditor-General, sir, was analysis and data that showed that there in fact is no financial crisis, there is no debt crisis, there is no infrastructure crisis in local government in New Zealand. There is a challenge over the next 5 to 6 years. There is an infrastructure deficit that councils are planning to meet, and local councils are increasingly turning to debt as a sensible way to spread the intergenerational burden of assets that have a long life. The level of borrowings, according to the Auditor-General's Office, held by authorities in the 2009-2010 years, sir, was $673 million higher than the previous year, and that debt to total revenue increased by 8% over the 2009-10 year. Well, you might think that is significant, but the highest debt to revenue percentages, sir, were only for a couple of local authorities, a couple of the very high growth local authorities, places like Queenstown and Tauranga, who are largely funding that infrastructure debt through development contributions. When we look at the big picture, we can see that an analysis of the long-term plans between 2009 and 2019 shows that there is an increase in debt. It's likely to go from 3.9 billion to about 11.2 billion at its peak, sir, in 2015-2016. And the Auditor-General's Office makes the comment that that is, and I quote, not so large when considered in the context of local authorities' overall balance sheets, their annual revenues and expenses. And in the Local Government and Environment Select Committee, when we asked the officials from Department of Internal Affairs to tell us to do some comparative analysis of local government income over the next decade compared to central government income and in fact household income, what emerged was that local government income was relatively static in a growing economy and was experiencing nothing like the increases in household income or central government income. So the whole standard cliched right-wing bogey that Rodney Hyde was kind of trotting out to try to justify an agenda of rolling back local government and opening the door to privatisation and PPPs turned out to be just that, sir, a bogey. And thankfully, his agenda for local government never got to first base. And all we saw in the local government amendment bill last year was a pretty watered-down, diluted shadow of the original ideas that the minister was touting at the beginning of last year. So we, as I said, Labor is very happy to support this bill. We think it's sensible and pragmatic. We look forward to debating it at Select Committee. And in light of the back down that the minister has had to make on this whole question of debt levels, we hope, sir, that the government, this John Key's government, will have a similar look at its own approach to privatisation of state assets and the disingenuous way that that public debt has been misrepresented in the mainstream media to justify the sale of state assets.
Time's expired.
Thank you.
Mr Speaker.
Dr Cam Calder.
Mr Speaker, despite the schadenfreude of the previous speaker, it's a pleasure